Welcome to Russian History with Dr. Brovkin. Today, my topic is Ukraine in search of its identity. As I already told you, a few months ago, I published a book, From Vladimir Lenin to Vladimir Putin, Russia in Search of Its Identity. Today, I'd like to focus on Ukraine. Ukraine is an independent nation. It was a victim of Russian aggression. Russian and Soviet aggression to Ukrainians have always taken place. Cited usually is the Holodomor, the famine of 1932. So Ukraine is a victim of mostly Russian and Soviet aggression that had been going on as long as one can remember, including under the Tsars. So that's the official narrative. And now I'd like to discuss what's wrong with this narrative and what is the opposition narrative. The policy is de-Sovietization and de-Russification or de-Russianization. So as a result of these policies today in Ukraine, what's going on is that as a result of the law of 2015, Russian language is no longer state language, so millions of people who speak Russian as a native language can speak it, but in official business, it's only Ukrainian. Schools are increasingly only Ukrainian. The names of streets are changed. The names of cities are changed. And it goes to such an incredible extent that the monument to Catherine II, who founded the city of Odessa, that had nothing to do with Ukraine at that time, this monument was removed. And then there are many other monuments in the process of de-Sovietization, decommunization, and de-Russification that are being removed. And there's a rewriting of history, and there's the assault on the Russian Orthodox Church, meaning the one that has allegiance to the Patriarch of Moscow, and so on and so forth. So, what's wrong with this narrative? Let's start with the year 1900. If one were to come to what is today called Ukraine, and at that time was called Malorussia or Core Russia, you could ask people in the countryside who they thought they were. Probably none of them would tell you that they were Ukrainian. That didn't exist. Now, in the 19th and early 20th century, these territories in what is today central Ukraine were called Malorussia, which means core Russia. Now, there's also two other areas of contemporary Ukraine that were not a part of Malorussia or Ukraine. One of them is in the east, and this is the Donbas area. The Donbas stands for the Don River basin of coal production, but also these are the lands of the former Don Cossacks, who never considered themselves anything but Russian. They had their own Cossack assembly. They were staunch defenders of the Tsar, and for that reason, as I describe it vividly in my book, there was a program of de-Kossakization, which was mass murder of the Cossacks by the Bolsheviks. In any case, that was not officially at all anything to do with Ukraine. Also, the very western part of today's Ukraine, which is called the Carpathian Mountains, Rus, these territories belong to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the people who lived there were in the countryside. They were Jews. In the cities, they were Jews and Poles, and in the countryside, Orthodox peasants. Now, the identity of all these three parts at that time were totally different. The central part, the core Russia, defined themselves as Orthodox and as peasants, and it would not be Ukrainian. They would, if you push them, and they would say Malorossian, but not Ukrainian. The concept of Ukraine was only popular among the elites, the educated elites who wanted to recreate Ukrainian nationhood. Now, most interesting is that in the western parts, which are today the hotbed of Ukrainian nationalism, at that time they were very pro-Russian because they were governed by Catholics, and their major identity was Orthodox, and they were very much looking to Russia as an Orthodox country of Orthodox Tsar, who they regarded as their allies against people around them who were Hungarian, Austrian, and Poles. All of those were Catholic, and the tradesmen in the cities were Jews. And this is the paradox of history, that the core of pro-Russian identity in Ukraine at that time was in West Ukraine. Now, in the East, of course, the identity was totally for Russia, because these people were Russian. So let's move on, and there are incredibly important changes with the Ukrainian identity when the Bolsheviks took over in 1917. One should mention that the Ukrainian People's Republic that was formed under the provisional government never sought to secede from Russia. They wanted autonomy. That was the deal with the provisional government. When the Bolsheviks took over, there were two important developments. Number one, they restored the name Ukraine because they were very much against any names that were associated with the Tsarist regime. They also decided to go all the way into promoting the rights of nationalities, including that of Ukraine. And that policy is known as Ukrainization of the government, of state institutions, and of the language. So there was this, the Ukrainians should be very grateful to the Bolsheviks, because they'd done more than anybody ever to promote Ukrainian language and its use in Ukraine. Moreover, at the same time, in the Carpathian area, which was under the rule of Poland, Ukrainian language was suppressed and was not allowed to be taught or used. So from that point of view, it was the Bolsheviks who promoted that. The second thing that the Bolsheviks did was that they created Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, equal to the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic. So they at the same time, they promoted communism, and there were to be a kind of Ukrainian nationality under communist rule. And for that reason, they added to the map of Ukraine the provinces that had never been Ukrainian and were populated by Russia. These are areas called Novorossiya, and these are the areas of Kharkov, Odessa, and the Don basin area where the civil war is going on right now. So these are the Bolshevik policies, and the Ukrainian identity actually got strengthened with the Bolshevik policy of Ukrainization. Now we go to the most interesting moment, and that is the Holodomor, which is something that today's Ukrainian historians say this is evidence of Russian Soviet genocide against the Ukrainian people. Is that right? Partly yes, but one has to add a very important qualification. This policy of man-made hunger was equally affecting Russian provinces as Ukrainian provinces. The communist regime oppressed peasants. Ukrainian peasants or Russian peasants didn't make any difference. They were against peasants as such, and this is in connection with this policy of collectivization. I deal with this in great detail with lots of archival documents in my previous book, which is called Russia After Lenin. And if you want, you could look about it. But in 1 minute, the story goes like this. Stalin didn't like the kulaks. The kulaks are rich peasants producing for the market. He decided to smash them in 1928, both in Russia and in Ukraine. They were arrested, they deported to Siberia, and there were about 2 million of those. Then the peasants were herded into collective farms and forced to work for free, essentially for nothing, as semi-serfs. And that caused immense protest of peasants, both in Russia and in Ukraine. And the protest was all kinds of bans, reforms, resistance, and partisan activity, all kinds of things. But also they slaughtered their animals. They didn't want their cows to be taken to collective farms. As a result of that was famine, requisitioning by the state, and slaughter of peasants, slaughter of animals caused this famine. and that is both affecting Russia and Ukraine equally. It was not a genocide against Ukrainian people, it was a genocide of all Soviet people, all peasants in all Soviet republics, including Kazakhstan. Now we go next to the important stage in the Ukrainian identity. The current regime says that they were victims of Stalinist repressions. Again, they were all equally affected by the Great Terror. And again, in my book From Lenin to Putin, there's a great new material on the Great Terror by Comrade Stalin. You could read of it. Now we go forward to the next and the perhaps most important and tragic turn of Ukrainian search for identity, and that is connected with the name of Stepan Bandera. He created a movement for independence, and it was based on hatred of the Poles, not the Russians at that point, the Poles. And it was his activity that is known as Volyn Reznia, which means mass murder of the Poles in Volyn province. Then the next group of people who they hated were the Jews, because they were traders in the towns and they were strong anti-Semitism in Ukraine. And then the third one were the Russians. So the ideology of Bandera is hatred of all those that surrounded Ukraine. It was a twisted nationalism based on non-acceptance of the other. And of course, it was tragic in the sense that on the 30th of June 1941, Bandera and his people wrote a letter to Hitler where they joined them in his struggle against Bolshevism and Jews and pledged support for the National Socialism in Germany. And they did. They were one of those few countries in Europe that during the war were collaborators. The Polizei, these people were killing the Jews and the Russians, and they were catching communists and delivering them to the Germans, Nazis. And that was the page of history that shouldn't be forgotten. Now, fast forward to the post-Soviet, post-war decades, Ukraine was no different from any other Soviet republic. None whatsoever. There was a strong communist party. It was very conservative, very hardcore, kind of Marxist-Leninist party. There were dissidents, Ukrainian dissidents, just as there were Russian dissidents. There was no difference whatsoever. Official identity was of Soviet men and women. Unofficial was a slow resurgence of national identity, both in Russia and in Ukraine. Now, if we move to the post-1991, what's important in terms of identity is that it was the meeting of the chiefs, Yeltsin and the Ukrainian counterpart and the Belarusian counterpart in the Belovesh forest in 1991, and they decided there to quit the Soviet Union. Gorbachev case, when they parted their ways in 1991, this is important, there was a treaty of friendship between Russia and Ukraine, open borders, pensions being paid to all of them, cooperation in industries that were jointly built, etc., etc. So there was supposed to be two brother nations that decided to split from the Soviet Union, but would continue to cooperate and to be good friends and brothers and neighbors. That went on for about 10 years. And as of the beginning of the 21st century, the nationalists began to increase their influence. And the Americans now, we know from Nuland, have spent $5 billion promoting the nationalist movement in Ukraine. Now, these people were increasingly anti-Soviet and anti-Russian, and they put the equation between the two. Soviet-Russian, same thing. That's not the same thing. That's the key. The Russian people suffered from the communist rule just as much as the Ukrainians. And it's a complete perversion of history to say Ukraine is the victim of Russia. No, Ukraine is a victim of the Soviet regime, of communists in power that oppressed all peoples of the Soviet Union. Now, in 2014, as we all know, there was this Maidan revolution, which means that the nationalists came to power, and that's when the Sovietization and de-Russification became a policy which provoked the rebellion in Donbass, that refused to accept the banning of the Russian language, that refused to accept the onslaught on the Russian Orthodox Church, and Crimea voted 98% to return to Russia, which it was in its history until 1954, when Khrushchev, without any referendum, gave it to Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. So what my main point here is that the policy of rewriting history, destruction of monuments, ban of the Orthodox Church, the persecution of Russian Orthodox priests, the banning of Russian language use, and closure of Russian schools, all these policies were exactly the opposite of what European values were supposed to be. It was exclusion rather than inclusion. It was intolerance rather than tolerance. It was a persecution of national minorities instead of providing them their rights, as it's supposed to be in Europe. So the paradox of history is that the twisted nationalism of Bandera that came from the very, very west of Ukraine, what used to be the core of a Russianhood in the history of these two peoples, now has become exactly the opposite, as a kind of a neo-Nazi regime. And the Americans now admit openly that they spent $1 billion strengthening that regime after 2014, instead of defending the European American values of democracy, inclusion, and tolerance. So the outcome of that is what Huntington had predicted in his book, The Clash of Civilizations. He wrote back in the 1990s that Ukraine is on the fault line, as he put it, of two civilizations, one leaning more to the west and the other to the east. And his words turned out to be prophetic. Because of the nationalist twist and policies, Ukraine split into two. And from 2014, there's a civil war going on, not Russian aggression, civil war in Ukraine between East and West. The civil war that involved Russian neighbors who took the side of Donbass against the persecution by the Ukrainian regime. Thank you very much, and I thank you for all kinds of comments that you wrote. Don't forget to subscribe, and my books are available on Amazon. Until next time, bye-bye.